The night I found out my wife had been cheating on me, I was knee-deep in a broken washing machine, cursing my past self for buying the energy-efficient model that, as it turned out, was neither energy-efficient nor particularly good at washing clothes. The drum had stopped spinning 3 days ago. Pamela, in her usual way, suggested we just buy a new one. "Why waste time fixing things when you can replace them?" she had said, tossing her hair over her shoulder in that way that used to make me feel something. That sentence hit differently now. But I was a man of principle. And by principle, I mean I was too stubborn to drop another $1,000 on a machine that, in my opinion, just needed a little coaxing. So there I was, in sweatpants and a t-shirt that had seen better days, my head halfway inside the washing machine like some suburban detective trying to crack the case of the missing spin cycle. And that's when I heard it. A laugh. Not from the TV. Not from Pamela, who was supposedly in the kitchen washing dishes, though I had yet to hear any actual dishwashing happening. No, this was a man's laugh. And it was coming from inside my house. Now, you have to understand, Pamela and I weren't exactly the drop-in guests type of people. We didn't have neighbors popping by unannounced. No close friends who just happened to be in the area. If someone was in my house laughing, it was because Pamela had invited them. And not just invited them, but invited them into a part of the house where guests don't usually go. I slowly pulled my head out of the washing machine, resisting the urge to grab a wrench, not because I was about to go full action movie hero, but because I suddenly had the very distinct feeling that something was about to need fixing, and it wasn't my washing machine. I stood there for a second, listening. The laughter was followed by a low, amused voice, too low for me to make out actual words, but there was something about the tone that made my skin itch. It was familiar, in the worst way possible. Like when you hear the beginning of a song that used to be your favorite before you found out the lead singer was a massive fraud. I walked down the hall, past the kitchen, which, surprise, had not a single dish washed, and toward the living room. And that's when I saw it. Pamela, sitting on the couch, legs tucked under her like she was settling in for a cozy movie night. And next to her, so close their knees were almost touching, was Greg Bennett. Greg Bennett. A name so aggressively average it should have belonged to an accountant or maybe a guy who sold insurance. But Greg Bennett was neither of those things. Greg Bennett was my neighbor from 2 streets over. The kind of guy who wore too much cologne and used words like champ when talking to grown men. He was the person who brought expensive bourbon to barbecues just so people would know he drank expensive bourbon. And he was sitting on my couch, laughing with my wife. In my house. "Oh, hey, babe," Pamela said when she noticed me standing there, as if I had just materialized out of thin air instead of emerging from a long, painful battle with an appliance. Greg turned his head toward me, a lazy grin on his face, completely comfortable, like he belonged there. And here's the thing, I knew. I didn't need any secret texts. No dramatic confessions. No conveniently placed receipts from a fancy restaurant I'd never been invited to. I knew. It was in the way Pamela's body language shifted, just slightly, when she realized I was standing there. The way Greg, who normally had the self-awareness of a brick wall, suddenly sat up a little straighter. The way the room itself seemed to vibrate with something unspoken, thick as smoke. I didn't say anything. I just looked at my wife and Greg Bennett, sitting there like this was just another Tuesday. Pamela was always good at talking her way out of things. She was the kind of person who could return a toaster to a store without a receipt and somehow walk out with a full refund in store credit. She knew how to spin a situation, how to control a conversation, how to steer it in a direction that made you feel like you were the one overreacting. But even she knew that this was a hard one to spin. She started anyway. "Greg just stopped by to borrow a book," she said, gesturing to the coffee table, where a hardcover novel sat completely unopened. A book. A book that Greg Bennett, the man who once told me he doesn't trust fiction, had apparently come to my house to borrow. There was an art to lying. And this? This was just insulting. Greg, for his part, had the decency to at least pretend to look guilty. He stood up, smoothing out his shirt like that would somehow erase the Greg Bennett-shaped stain on my evening. "I should probably get going," he said, his voice a little too chipper for someone who had just been caught not borrowing a book. Pamela didn't stop him. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought about how different this scene would have played out if the roles were reversed. If I had been the one sitting too close to a woman on the couch. If Pamela had walked in and found me laughing with someone she knew, someone she had invited into our lives. Would she have bought the same story she was expecting me to believe? Not a chance. The front door closed behind Greg. The silence that followed was heavy, like the moment before a storm. I looked at Pamela. She looked at me. And I smiled. Because she had no idea what was coming next. Larry never liked Greg Bennett. That wasn't a new feeling. It wasn't jealousy or suspicion, it was just that Greg was the kind of guy who made everything about himself, even things that had nothing to do with him. He could turn any conversation into an opportunity to talk about his latest business venture, which was usually just a rebranded version of a business venture that had already failed 6 months ago. Greg was the guy who would show up late to a party and then ask the host if they had any food left, completely ignoring the fact that he had never RSVP'd in the first place. And now Greg was sitting in Larry's house, on Larry's couch, with Larry's wife, pretending like he had a valid reason for being there. Pamela was playing it cool, like she had rehearsed for this exact moment. Maybe she had. She didn't rush to explain herself, which in a way was even worse. It meant she thought she was in control of the situation, like she had some sort of leverage. Greg stood up, making a big show of checking the time on his watch. Anyway, I should get going, he said, as if anyone in the room had asked him to stay. Larry nodded, which was probably the most generous reaction he could give at that moment. He stepped aside, letting Greg walk past him toward the front door. Pamela didn't get up to walk him out, which Larry noticed. She didn't even say goodbye. That was interesting. That meant she wanted to act like Greg leaving was no big deal, which meant it was a big deal. The door clicked shut. Pamela finally spoke. What? Larry tilted his head, pretending to think about that. What do you mean, what? She crossed her arms. You're staring at me like I did something wrong. He let out a short laugh. Oh, you mean like inviting Greg Bennett over to sit on our couch for a friendly book club meeting? Her expression didn't change. That was the thing about Pamela, she was committed. Even if the world was crumbling around her, she'd double down. He stopped by for a few minutes. You're acting weird. Larry nodded slowly. Right. Yeah. I'm the one acting weird. She sighed, shaking her head. You know, if you have something to say, just say it. That was the first crack. She wanted him to say something specific, to give her something to work with. He wasn't going to do that. Fine, Larry said. Let's talk about it. He gestured to the couch. Go ahead. Explain why Greg was here. Pamela rolled her eyes, but she sat down. He came over to borrow a book. Larry sat across from her. Which book? Pamela didn't hesitate. A business book. The one you bought last year. Larry almost smiled. He didn't own a single business book. Right, he said. And you're saying Greg, who thinks reading is a waste of time, came all the way over here to borrow a book? Pamela leaned back. Yes. And he was here for, what, an hour? 15 minutes, she corrected. 15 minutes, Larry repeated. So you're telling me that in 15 minutes, he showed up, asked to borrow a book, you found the book, and then you two sat on the couch laughing about something so funny that I could hear it from the laundry room? Pamela's face didn't change, but he knew her well enough to see the shift in her posture. It wasn't like that, she said. Then what was it like? Pamela shrugged. We were just talking. Larry leaned forward. About what? Why does it matter? Oh, it matters. Pamela looked away, like she was debating whether or not to keep arguing. Then, finally, she sighed. Fine. If you really want to know, he came over to talk about some issues he's having. Relationship stuff. Larry raised an eyebrow. Relationship stuff? Pamela nodded. Yes. He's been having problems with his girlfriend. Greg doesn't have a girlfriend. Pamela blinked, and for the first time, Larry saw her hesitate. He does, she said. You don't know everything about him. Larry laughed. Pamela, Greg tells everyone everything about himself whether they ask or not. If he had a girlfriend, we'd all know about it. So let's try again. Why was he really here? Pamela stood up. I don't have to explain myself to you. Larry nodded. That's true. But see, here's the problem. You didn't expect me to come into the room when I did. You thought you'd have time to come up with a better excuse. But you didn't. And now you're stuck with a really bad one. Pamela crossed her arms. You're overreacting. Larry let out a short breath. Sure. Okay. I'm overreacting. So, just to be clear, I could go over to Greg's place right now, ask him about this conversation you two had, and he'd tell me the exact same thing you just did? Pamela hesitated again. Larry smiled. That's what I thought. Pamela's jaw tightened. You know what? I don't have to sit here and be interrogated in my own home. She started to walk past him, but Larry didn't move. That's fine, he said. We can talk about it later. Or maybe we don't have to talk about it at all. Maybe I should just ask Greg the next time I see him. I'm sure he'd love to clear everything up. Pamela froze. He had her. She knew it, and he knew it. Don't, she said. Larry tilted his head. Why not? She turned back toward him, her expression unreadable. Because Greg doesn't know what I told you, she said. Larry's smile didn't fade. Now that, he said, is the most honest thing you've said all night. Larry never claimed to be the smartest guy in the world, but he also wasn't a fool. There was a certain threshold of stupidity he refused to cross, and believing Pamela's latest excuse was just a little too far past that line. Greg Bennett had been in his house, sitting on his couch, acting way too comfortable, and now Pamela was in full damage control mode. That meant she had something to hide. It was a simple equation. 2 + 2 = 4, and in this case, for meant his wife was lying straight to his face. Pamela, being Pamela, wasn't going to just admit anything. No, she was going to drag this out, twist things around, make Larry feel like he was the one losing his mind. She had a talent for it. If gaslighting were an Olympic sport, she'd have taken home the gold, smiling for the cameras while handing Larry a participation ribbon for most paranoid husband. So, Larry said, stretching out the word just enough to let her know he wasn't buying a single thing she'd said so far, Greg just randomly stopped by. For a book. Pamela exhaled, tilting her head like she was talking to a particularly slow child. Yes, Larry. A book. People do that. It's not weird. Larry nodded. Right. And you guys just sat on the couch and talked? Yes. For 15 minutes. Yes. And you were laughing. Pamela folded her arms. Yes, Larry, I laughed. I do that sometimes. Larry scratched his chin. Funny. You don't laugh that much when I talk to you. Pamela rolled her eyes so hard Larry was worried they might get stuck. Oh, come on. Larry leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Okay, let's make this really simple. What's the name of the book Greg borrowed? Pamela hesitated. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Larry caught it. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, and for a split second, he could almost hear the gears turning in her head, scrambling for an answer that would make sense. The one about finance, she finally said. Larry smirked. Yeah? Which one? Pamela shot him a glare. You know. The, investing one. Larry chuckled. That's funny, Pamela. You know why that's funny? Because I don't own a single book about investing. And Greg? He thinks the stock market is just a scam for rich people. His words, not mine. Pamela's jaw tightened. Okay, you know what? I don't remember the exact title. Does it matter? Oh, it matters, Larry said. It matters a whole lot. Pamela huffed, shifting in her seat. You're being ridiculous. And you're lying, Larry shot back. Pamela stood up. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. Larry stayed seated, watching her. Sure, you can leave. But you know what I can do? I can walk right over to Greg's place and ask him about that book myself. Pamela froze. Bingo! She turned back to face him, and for the first time since this conversation started, she looked nervous. Larry grinned. Oh, what's wrong? You don't want me to ask Greg about his big interest in literature? Pamela took a deep breath, like she was trying to keep herself from saying something she'd regret. Larry, just drop it. Nah, see, I don't think I will, Larry said, standing up. Because here's the thing, Pamela, I know when someone's lying to me. And you? You're a terrible liar. Pamela scoffed. I am not a terrible liar. Larry laughed. Oh, so you are lying? Pamela blinked. Wait, no. That's not. Larry clapped his hands. Gotcha. Pamela groaned, rubbing her temples. Oh my God, Larry. Can you just let it go? Larry crossed his arms. Sure. Just admit what's really going on. Pamela hesitated again, then sighed dramatically. Fine. You want the truth? Greg came over to talk about his relationship problems, okay? He's been having a rough time, and I was just being a good friend. Larry stared at her. A good friend? Yes. You're friends with Greg now? Pamela scoffed. We've always been friendly. Larry shook his head. No, we have been friendly with Greg. You've never had a conversation with him that lasted more than 2 minutes. Now, all of a sudden, you're his personal therapist? Pamela threw her hands up. Why is it such a big deal? Why do you have to make everything into some massive conspiracy? Because you're lying, Larry said flatly. And the harder you try to make me feel crazy, the more obvious it is. Pamela glared at him. You have no proof of anything. Larry smirked. Not yet. Pamela took a step back. Larry. He held up a hand. No, don't bother. I know when someone's guilty, Pamela. And right now? You're sweating. Pamela quickly crossed her arms, like she could physically block the accusation. Larry nodded. That's what I thought. Pamela clenched her jaw. This is insane. No, Larry corrected. This is me finally seeing through your nonsense. Pamela didn't have a response. For the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. And Larry? He was just getting started. Larry knew Pamela had been lying to him for a while, but now she was just getting lazy with it. That was almost offensive. If you're going to betray your husband, at least put in the effort. Try a little harder. Maybe rehearse in front of a mirror before spitting out a story that falls apart after the second question. Greg Bennett borrowing a book? Laughable. Pamela being Greg's emotional support system? Even worse. The idea of Greg confiding in anyone other than a mirror or an audience he trapped at a dinner party was downright insulting. Pamela stood there, arms crossed, giving Larry that look she always gave when she was daring him to push further. It used to work. That look used to stop him in his tracks, make him second-guess himself, make him fold before the fight even started. Not this time. Larry smiled, just enough to let her know she wasn't winning this one. So, if I ask Greg about your heart-to-heart, he'll back up your story? Pamela's fingers twitched. Not much, but enough. I don't know why you feel the need to drag other people into our business. Larry nodded. Ah. I see. So Greg is now our business? Pamela sighed, exasperated. Larry. Just let it go. See, that's the problem, Pam. I don't want to. Pamela threw up her hands. This is ridiculous. Larry leaned forward. Yeah? What's ridiculous? That I'm questioning why another man was in my house while I was in the other room? That I'm asking why my wife, who normally wouldn't give Greg Bennett the time of day, suddenly wants to play therapist? What part of this is ridiculous, Pamela? Pamela shook her head, muttering something under her breath. Larry tilted his head. Sorry, didn't catch that. Say it louder. I said you're being paranoid. Larry laughed. Oh, there it is. That's the classic move, isn't it? Step 1, get caught doing something shady. Step 2, make your husband feel like a fool for noticing. Pamela narrowed her eyes. This is why I didn't want to tell you. I knew you'd act like this. Larry sat back, crossing his arms. Tell me what? Pamela hesitated. That half second where she had to make a decision, go all in on the lie, or come up with a slightly less ridiculous one. Then she sighed. Greg and I were talking about you. Larry let out a slow breath. Of course you were. Pamela kept going, like she actually believed she was controlling the conversation. He's been worried about you. He thinks you're, stressed. On edge. And I told him I noticed it too. Larry nodded, like he was really considering this. Right. So Greg, a man who has never cared about anyone but himself, suddenly became deeply invested in my emotional state? Pamela crossed her arms again, as if doubling down on her nonsense would make it true. Yes. Larry rubbed his chin. You know what's funny about that, Pam? If you were actually worried about me, you'd have talked to me. Not Greg. Not a guy whose idea of self-improvement is switching from vodka to tequila. Pamela groaned. See? This is what I mean. You're always so sarcastic about everything. You don't take anything seriously. Larry nodded. And yet, somehow, I'm the only one taking this seriously. Pamela stared at him, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She was out of moves. She had nowhere to go. And for the first time since this started, she knew it. Larry stood up. I think I'll go have a chat with Greg. Pamela's face twitched. Larry, don't. Why not? Because it's embarrassing. Larry raised an eyebrow. Oh, now it's embarrassing? You weren't embarrassed when you let him in? When you sat on that couch with him? Pamela exhaled sharply. Just, can you not turn this into some huge drama? Larry shrugged. That depends. Do you want to tell me the truth now, or should I get it from Greg? Pamela looked away. There it was. That half second of panic, the one she thought she could hide, but Larry had known her too long not to catch it. I just needed someone to talk to, she muttered. Larry laughed. Oh, I bet you did. Pamela's head snapped back to him. Oh, what does that mean? Larry didn't answer. He just turned and grabbed his jacket off the chair. Pamela's voice rose slightly. Larry, where are you going? He slung the jacket over his shoulder. To confirm some details. You cool with that? Pamela took a step forward. You're really going to Greg's house? Larry smirked. Why? You worried about what he'll say? Pamela clenched her fists at her sides. No, I'm worried about you making a fool of yourself. Larry nodded. Sure. That's gotta be it. Pamela stood there, watching him, like she was trying to decide if she could still salvage this mess. Larry pulled open the door. I'll let you know what I find out. Pamela didn't stop him. Because she couldn't. Larry wasn't the type to make unplanned visits to people's houses. He figured if someone wanted to see him, they'd either call, text, or better yet, not want to see him at all. That system worked fine for him. But today was an exception. Today, he had a very specific reason for showing up at Greg Bennett's place uninvited. Greg lived in a house that was trying too hard. Big, unnecessary columns out front, some fancy stonework that didn't match anything else, and one of those oversized front doors that made it seem like a medieval king lived there instead of a guy who got rich selling overpriced supplements to people who believed in energy frequencies. It was the kind of place that screamed, "I want people to think I have more money than I actually do." Larry didn't bother knocking. He rang the doorbell and waited, hands in his pockets, already running through every possible way this conversation could go. Greg took his time answering, probably because he was the type of guy who thought making people wait added to his importance. When the door finally swung open, Greg was standing there in gym clothes, despite not having an athletic bone in his body. His face went from neutral to fake friendly the second he saw who it was. "Larry! What's up, man?" Larry gave him a tight-lipped smile. "I was in the area." Greg nodded like that was a completely normal explanation. Cool. You wanna come in?" Larry stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Greg closed the door behind him, suddenly looking a little less relaxed. "So, what's up?" Greg asked, scratching his jaw. Larry turned to him. "I had an interesting conversation with Pamela today." Greg's fingers twitched. It was subtle, but it was there. "Oh yeah?" Greg forced a chuckle. "She good?" Larry tilted his head. "You tell me. You were just at my house." Greg's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, yeah. I stopped by for a bit. Just catching up." Larry nodded slowly. "Right. Catching up. That's what she said." Greg's eyebrows pulled together. "Dude, why do I feel like there's a weird energy in this conversation?" Larry smirked. "Because there is, Greg." Greg exhaled through his nose. "Okay, man, you're gonna have to spell it out for me. What's going on?" Larry studied him. "Pamela says you came over to borrow a book." Greg blinked. "A book?" Larry raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. You know, one of mine." Greg looked confused for a solid 2 seconds before nodding rapidly. "Oh. Right, yeah. That book." Larry nodded. "Which one was it?" Greg's mouth opened, then closed. The finance one?" Larry sighed. "Greg, you and I both know you don't read finance books." Greg scratched the back of his neck. "Well, you know, I'm trying to get into." "Don't." Greg shut his mouth. Larry crossed his arms. "So let's try again. Why were you at my house?" Greg looked around, like the answer might be written on his walls somewhere. "Look, man, I think there's been some kind of miscommunication." Larry chuckled. "Oh, buddy, I don't think there has." Greg let out a breath. "Larry, listen." "No, you listen," Larry cut in. "Because right now, I've got two options. Either you tell me exactly what's going on, or I make a few calls and get my answers a different way." Greg's shoulders tensed. "What kind of calls?" Larry shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe to a few people who might know more than you want them to." Greg swallowed. "There's really nothing to." Larry held up a hand. "Save it. You've got one shot to tell me the truth before I go digging myself. And let me tell you something, Greg, you do not want me to start digging." Greg exhaled through his nose. "All right. Fine." Larry waited. Greg rubbed his face. "Pamela and I have been talking." Larry didn't react. "Talking." Greg nodded. "Yeah. She's been feeling, stuck lately." Larry's jaw clenched. "Stuck." Greg nodded again. "Yeah, like, you guys have been together a long time, and she's been questioning some stuff." Larry's fingers twitched, but he kept his voice even. "And you, what? Decided to help her sort through her emotions?" Greg looked at the floor. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, man. Larry laughed. Oh, you didn't? So Pamela just accidentally ended up confiding in you? Greg shifted uncomfortably. Look, she's been unhappy, alright? And she needed someone to talk to. Larry nodded. Right. Because when a woman feels stuck in her marriage, the logical person to confide in is the guy who hits on waitresses at family restaurants. Greg sighed. It wasn't like that. Larry tilted his head. So what was it like, Greg? Greg hesitated. We just clicked, I guess. Larry stared at him. Clicked. Greg nodded. Yeah, I mean, we didn't plan anything. We were just talking at first. Larry's eye twitched. At first. Greg hesitated again. Look, man, I don't want to get into the details. Larry's voice was calm, but sharp. Oh, you're gonna. Greg ran a hand through his hair. Pamela and we've been seeing each other. For a little while. Larry didn't move. Didn't blink. Just let the words sit in the air between them. Greg shifted his weight. I know this sucks. I do. And I didn't want to be that guy, but it just happened. Larry let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, it just happened? Greg looked pained. I never wanted to hurt you. Larry stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right. Greg blinked. All right? Larry put his hands in his pockets. Yeah. That's all I needed to hear. Greg looked nervous. So, what now? Larry smirked. Oh, don't worry. You'll find out. And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Greg standing there, looking like a man who had just realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Larry wasn't mad. Not in the way Pamela probably expected him to be. She was the type who always assumed anger meant yelling, breaking things, storming out dramatically like some guy in a bad soap opera. But Larry wasn't interested in theatrics. No, he was something much worse. He was done. There was no need for screaming matches or drawn-out arguments. The facts were simple. Pamela had been sneaking around with Greg Bennett of all people, a man so desperate for attention that he once faked an ankle injury at a backyard barbecue just so people would ask him what happened. Larry wasn't going to fight over her. He wasn't going to beg for explanations. She had made her choices. He was just going to make sure she lived with them. When he walked back into the house, Pamela was sitting at the kitchen table, phone in her hand, pretending to look like a normal wife who hadn't just been exposed as a liar. She didn't even bother looking up. Have a nice walk, she asked, her voice laced with fake indifference. Larry smirked. She was nervous. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, resting his arms on the table. I talked to Greg. Pamela's fingers tightened around her phone, just slightly. Oh? Larry nodded. Yeah. He had a lot to say. Pamela finally looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like weeks. Larry, whatever he told you. Oh, don't do that, Larry cut in. Don't start spinning some new version of events. Don't try to tell me he made it up. We're past that. Pamela's lips pressed together. Larry leaned back in his chair. You know, if you'd picked literally anyone else, I might have had a harder time believing it. But Greg? You thought that was gonna stay secret? Greg Bennett can't keep his own business quiet, let alone someone else's. Pamela exhaled through her nose. It's not what you think. Larry tilted his head. Oh, this should be good. What do I think? Pamela hesitated. I didn't mean for it to happen. Larry laughed. Ah, there it is. The classic oops, I tripped and fell into an affair defense. Pamela rolled her eyes. That's not what I meant. Larry held up a hand. You know what? Doesn't matter. You did what you did. And now we're gonna deal with it. Pamela folded her arms. Meaning what? Larry smiled. We're done. Pamela blinked. Just like that? Just like that, Larry confirmed. She scoffed. Larry, be serious. Oh, I am very serious. Pamela shook her head. This isn't how marriage works. You don't just walk away. Larry raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure you already walked away first. I'm just catching up. Pamela looked at him like he had just spoken in a foreign language. So, what? That's it? You're not even gonna try to fix this? Larry laughed again, this time leaning forward. Fix what, Pamela? Fix the fact that you've been sneaking around with Greg? That you lied to my face over and over? What exactly do you think I'm supposed to do here? Send you to time out and call it even? Pamela stared at him, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she looked genuinely afraid. Not afraid of him, but afraid of what this meant for her. Larry, she started, her voice softer now, we've built a life together. You can't just throw that away. Larry's smirk faded. You did. Pamela swallowed. I made a mistake. Larry nodded. Yeah, you did. She reached across the table, like physical contact would somehow make him forget everything. We can figure this out. Larry stood up. No. You can figure it out. I already have. Pamela's jaw clenched. You're being unfair. Larry let out a breath. You know what's unfair? Me wasting any more of my time on someone who clearly didn't care enough to be honest with me. Pamela's eyes darted away, like she was trying to think of another angle to play. I was just confused. Larry scoffed. Yeah? Well, let me make things crystal clear for you. I'm out. Pamela opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She sat there, watching him, realizing that this was real. Larry wasn't bluffing. He wasn't threatening. He was done. He turned toward the hallway. I'll start packing my stuff tonight. Pamela shot up from her seat. Wait. Larry stopped but didn't turn around. Pamela's voice cracked slightly. You're really leaving? Larry took a deep breath. No, Pamela. I already left. And with that, he walked down the hall, leaving her standing there, finally realizing that this time, she wasn't going to talk her way out of it. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and rate the story in the comments.